Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Frank Vesta, and thanks for being with us. If you're a regular listener of the show, you heard us talk about abortion about a month and a half ago, when there were 8 related ballot measures across the country. At that point in time, that would have already been a record for these sorts of ballot measures in any given year to date. And if you fast forward to today, that number shot all the way up to 11. So again, that's a record 11 abortion-related ballot measures across the country coming up in just a few weeks that voters are going to decide on. There are a few issues weighing as heavily on the minds of voters this fall as abortion, and let's face it, there might not be an issue harder to talk about from a nonpartisan perspective. We've got a two-parter for you today. In the second half of the show, I'll be joined by Julie Rovner of KFF Health and News' chief Washington correspondent and the host of their weekly podcast, What the Health. Julie and I will tackle how messaging around abortion has evolved post-Roe being overturned, the latest related to IVF treatment policy, how federal policymakers could try to regain control over the issue, and more, so be sure to stay tuned for that. But first, I'm joined by Nicole Fisher, one of our staff writers on the ballot measures team here at Ballotpedia, to break down the slate of 11 abortion-related ballot measures around the country. Nicole, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you back. I know you were just here a couple weeks ago, so we're really appreciative of your time in this busy election season. So we see measures to provide access to abortion in 9 states. That's Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Maryland, Missouri, Montana, New York, Nevada, and South Dakota. But in Nebraska, we've got another 2 measures, one that's providing a right to abortion and one to limit them. Again, if I've got all that right, it's a lot to keep track of. So to start, can you give us an understanding of what these measures would do in their respective states?
Yeah, totally. So there are 11 total measures people will be voting on this November. 10 of them will provide the constitutional right to an abortion. There's some differences in each state. So 10 would either expand or protect or provide the right to an abortion. Whereas Nebraska does have those 2 measures. One of them would restrict abortion in that state. Right to abortion constitutional amendments specifically have been coming onto the ballot really since the Dobbs decision, the U.S. Supreme Court decision that overturned Roe versus Wade. These right to abortion amendments essentially enshrines it within the Constitution to invalidate any state laws that go against that amendment. So, for example, Florida has a ban on abortion after 6 weeks. So Amendment 4, which is on the ballot in Florida, would provide for the right to an abortion up to fetal viability, which is usually around 21 to 24 weeks. It depends on who you ask, who's talking about that. So any measure that goes against that would be invalidated. And when we've seen measures in the ballot to provide the right to an abortion since Dobbs, every right to abortion amendment has been approved by voters. Any ballot measure that has tried to restrict abortion access has been rejected by voters since Dobbs.
How many ballot measures are we looking at that have passed in that way?
Since Dobbs. So in 2022, there were 6 total measures. So there were 3 amendments that have passed. So amendments that provided the right to an abortion. And then there were 3 measures in 2022 that either restricted abortion access, and those all failed. So in 2023, we also had 1 measure on the ballot in Ohio, which provided the right to an abortion in the Constitution, and that was passed by voters. So now we have 11 total measures in 2024, which is the most on record.
Again, thinking about this year, how did these measures look different? Are there any other particularities in any of the states we should know about?
New York is a little different because it doesn't mention abortion specifically, but it would provide that people can't be denied rights based on pregnancy outcomes, reproductive health care, and autonomy. So that amendment could be interpreted to establish the right to an abortion in the state. And out of the 10 right to abortion amendments, 7 out of 10 of them regulate abortion after fetal viability in some way. So they include within the language of the amendment that either the state can regulate abortion after fetal viability, or usually unless to protect the life or health of the mother. And South Dakota has more of a trimester framework, which is interesting. So it provides the right to an abortion in the first trimester. The second trimester, it can regulate abortion, but only in ways that are related to the physical health of the pregnant woman. And in the third trimester, it provides that the state can regulate or prohibit abortion unless to preserve the life and health of the mother.
Got it. A lot to keep track of there. So I'm impressed with your ability to summarize all of these at the same time. So we're seeing several swing states or states with tight elections with these measures in place, which again, that's what everybody's talking about this year. In Arizona and Nevada, those are some of the closest in the presidential election. Montana, and to a lesser extent, Florida and Maryland might have tight Senate races. So will these ballot measures impact voting in those states, or is this seen as kind of a separate issue? I feel like high-profile debates that are going on in the country would drive a lot of voters out to the polls. That's what you at least what I might think at first. But what do we know about how that's looking for this election?
So there's a lot of debate back and forth on whether ballot measures themselves end up influencing the way voters vote in other races on the ballot. So if we're looking at maybe the presidential ticket, or we're looking at Senate races, state Senate races, et cetera, we have seen turnout increase in some states. So for example, in Kansas in 2022, they had record turnout when voters in August of 2022 voted against an amendment that would have prohibited or restricted abortion. And those turnout numbers were kind of what you see in maybe general election. So I think it was 900,000 voters that turned out August 2022. You usually see much lower turnout for primaries in Kansas, whereas general elections in Kansas, you might get in the million range or a little above that. Also, Michigan and Vermont have seen increased turnout. So those, when we had amendments in the ballot in Michigan and in Vermont, which provided for the right to an abortion, we saw voter turnout increase. However, in other states, so California also had a measure on the ballot, so did Kentucky and Montana, voter turnout decreased in those states slightly. So it does depend. Ohio increased as well in 2023, so we have a mixed bag as far as voter turnout. And when we look kind of at polling, we see, for example, in Florida, Arizona, other states, that voters largely support abortion amendments or right to abortion amendments. You know, Trump may win in polls in those states against Harris or Biden when we've looked at previous polls. So it's not always strictly down party lines. So you have a lot of Republicans that might vote for right to abortion amendments. It's not necessarily that someone is automatically going to vote for Democrats if they vote for a right to an abortion amendment. So it's kind of mixed. So it really depends on what we see at Election Day. So it's hard to say whether it will directly influence the other races on the ballot or other races on the ticket, but we'll see.
Looking back at measures in the past couple of years in generally red states, I'm thinking here like Ohio, Kentucky, and Kansas, to name a few. What do those tell us about how these measures might perform this year?
Like I previously said, the right to abortion amendments in mostly mixed states, red states, have passed. So every abortion measure on the ballot since Dobbs, measures that provided right to an abortion have passed. Measures that would restrict abortion have failed, even in red states. So when you look at polling in Arizona, Florida, Nevada, other battleground states, you do see those measures passing, sometimes in large numbers. So, for example, Nevada's polling shows it passing by 75%. Arizona shows their right to abortion amendment passing either by 58%, 73%. So almost all showing it passing. Florida's a little different because unlike other states, Florida requires a 60% majority. So you need more than half the vote. So it needs 60% of the vote. In Florida, I see it failing 55%. So it gets the majority, but it fails to pass because it needs 60%. But I also see it passing 61%, 69%. So Florida could potentially be tighter because we do see it passing and failing depending on the polling. So yeah, it really depends on the voters this fall. And I think that largely a lot of these measures will pass. But Florida, I'm keeping an eye on because of that 60% supermajority.
Yeah, so many question marks when it comes to ballot measures in Florida this year. So much to watch. Nicole Fisher of our ballot measures team, thank you as always for your time. Really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you so much.
Listeners, we're going to take a quick break. Stay tuned. We'll be right back with the big picture when it comes to abortion policy and specifically what's going on around this year's election with Julie Rovner of the Kaiser Family Foundation. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Between registering and researching your candidates, voting does not begin at the ballot box. It begins much earlier, and I know you know that. But you might not know about some of the great tools that we have here at Ballotpedia to help you research your candidates or what's on your ballot. This is Allison from Ballotpedia's communication team, and I want to talk to you a little bit about voting this November. From beginning to end of the voting process, Ballotpedia is here for you with our 2024 election voter toolkit. The toolkit allows you to see specifically who will be on your ballot with our sample ballot lookup tool. It's going to help you find ballot measure information, which is super helpful. That ballot information that we offer also puts ballot measures in really easy to understand layperson's terms. So if you are reading a ballot measure and you're not quite sure what it means, our voter toolkit can help you with that. Offices that are up for election in your area. And you can also view our frequently asked questions about voting. Whether you're a seasoned voter like me or will be voting for the first time ever, and if you are, congratulations, we're here to help. Use our toolkit to show up to your polling location, prepped and ready to go. We've got this, and we've got you.
So, Julie, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Nicole gave us a bit of an overview of the measures in place for the 2024 election, what they say, all of the finer details. With you, I'd like to tackle more of the big issues when it comes to these policies and their impact. With abortion now largely a state issue, right, post-Dobbs, do you anticipate that the federal lawmakers or candidates even will try to reclaim more control over abortion policy, or do you think that this will remain mostly a state-level battle from here on out?
Oh, I think that both sides would like the federal government to get back into this. Those who support abortion rights, mostly Democrats, would like to reinstate, codify right into law some protections, some national minimum protections. And those on the other side, there's a lot of ways a Republican administration could go after not just abortion, but birth control and IVF and other reproductive health issues in states where currently abortion rights are protected.
Since Roe v. Wade's overturned, we've seen so much evolve in the national debate around the issue, not just within the states, right? And across the country, both parties have really dramatically altered their rhetoric and their arguments around the issue, how they frame it, especially in battleground states, which again, like every year, every election cycle are going to matter a ton this year. It seems to me, Julie, that the semantics of all this matter so much.
Yeah, they really do. For a long time, particularly Republicans could be safely anti-abortion and say, we want to overturn Roe v. Wade with what they assumed was the comfort that it was never going to happen. I mean, there were a lot of people who were very, very confident that they could just, tell their supporters who were very strongly anti-abortion that they are with them no matter what, despite what, polls suggest that a majority of Americans support abortion rights. That was before Roe was overturned and since Roe has been overturned. Of course, then Roe gets overturned and now the rubber meets the road. And, it put a lot of Republicans in a very awkward situation. It's like, oh, we didn't think this was really going to happen. And now we have constituents who are Republicans who support abortion rights or support abortion rights, at least in some situations. And now we're really stuck. So what we're seeing is some creative wordsmithing, if you will. They don't want to say they're supporting a ban, but they do say they're supporting minimum standards. They're sort of trying to have it both ways because they know that they have voters who are on both sides of this issue, and that's problematic. It's funny, until Roe was overturned, this was mostly a problem for Democrats who had voters on both sides of this issue. There's a very large and long has been segment of anti-abortion Democrats. There are fewer Republicans who support abortion rights and fewer Democrats who are anti-abortion than there used to be. There used to be a much more significant group in each party, and they are sort of sorting themselves out. But Democrats for a long time had difficulty with the segments of their base that opposed abortion.
In the states where we're seeing ballot measures related to abortion this year, how are you noticing in your reporting those mental gymnastics kind of play out for both parties?
Well, as I said, there are a lot of Republicans, not just at the top of the ticket, Republicans running for the House and the Senate, who are suddenly trying to paper over their records of voting for strict abortion restrictions or saying that they supported the overturn of Roe v. Wade, which most of them did. As I said, a lot of them thought it was a safe thing to say because they didn't think it was ever going to happen and it was going to please that part of their base without ever actually having to deal with the reality of it. And there is an awful lot of backpedaling, shall we say, at the moment. And Democrats, I think, fairly calling them out on it, saying, well, you actually did vote for this. We've had a few candidates who have actually said that they have changed their minds. Larry Hogan in Maryland is one of them. Now, Larry Hogan was always pretty moderate on abortion for a Republican. He was sort of almost to the Susan Collins level, of course, a Republican from Maine who has sort of famously supported abortion rights, although she voted for the Supreme Court justices who overturned Roe, but I digress. Larry Hogan came out, he was running for Senate in Maryland, very blue state. He was a Republican governor, two-term Republican governor in a very blue state. So he governed as a moderate, and he did come out in the spring and say he is now 100% pro-choice, which he has not been. But at least it wasn't sort of this enormous leap that it has been for some of these other representatives and senators who are really trying to run away from their records.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I feel like in those states that kind of have mixed government, to see that the top of the state government is a Republican and the rest of the state is Democratic or vice versa, especially when it comes to an issue like this. It's really, really interesting to watch just the different strategies they take, the different ways they try to frame issues and how, they try to make them marketable to voters and figure out how they're feeling too.
Yes, absolutely. And, one of the things I think we've seen since Dobbs got overturned is that the public has had a much more robust debate about abortion. It was a thing that people didn't talk about a lot. I mean, the activists did, but everybody else, it was just sort of there. And the status quo was the status quo. And, all of these abortion rights activists saying, abortion is healthcare, and the anti-abortion, people saying, no, it's not. Well, now we're getting into this troublesome place where we discover that a lot of pregnancies have a lot of problems. And sometimes actually abortion is needed healthcare. And these arguments about whether or not, well, is it really an abortion if you have an ectopic pregnancy that needs to be terminated? Well, medically, yes, it is. That's what they call it. So that's part of this whole semantic issue. But I do think that there has been, and it's been a useful debate, that people are seeing that pregnancies do not always go well. Not every abortion is because woman wakes up one morning and decides she no longer wants to be pregnant. There are a lot of people who have a lot of pregnancy complications, and these are often very tragic situations. And guess what? They happen all the time. It's just that we didn't talk about them before.
And you mentioned healthcare there, so let's pivot in that direction. You've reported extensively on how abortion restrictions influence where medical professionals choose to work or students choose to study, which I think is really, really interesting. I didn't really know a ton about that before seeing your reporting. What are the long-term implications for access to broader healthcare services, particularly, again, in rural areas where generally healthcare is hard to come by?
Right. We've already seen that it's difficult, particularly for pregnant women, to get OB care in some of these maternity healthcare deserts. There are not very many OBGYNs. There are not very many hospitals with labor and delivery units. They often have to travel sometimes hundreds of miles. And as I just pointed out, many pregnancies have complications. It is not safe being pregnant. It's amazing that we continue as a species, because it really is. It is risky every time someone gets pregnant. And what we're seeing is not just doctors leaving, and we are seeing doctors picking up and leaving. And I would sort of alert you to Idaho, where this has been a really big problem in a really rural state. But also what we're seeing are students who are graduating medical school and wanting to go off and do their residencies. And of course, where students do those residencies tends to be where they stay in practice, which graduating medical students know. And they're saying, do I want to go to these states with these abortion bans where I won't necessarily learn to do some of the things I need to do to deal with pregnancy complications? Even if they don't ever intend to do an elective abortion, these are things that they need to understand so that when an emergency happens, they can deal with them. In order to get abortion training now, these residents are going to have to go out of state, which is what they're doing. But again, that's usually for a fairly short time. It's not something they're going to see in their routine. But I've been talking to a lot of graduating medical students, and they're torn because they want to go to these places where they are most needed, where there is a problem. And it's not just OBGYNs. For a while we thought it would be OBGYNs and maybe doctors who are in, family practice who sometimes deliver babies. But I literally this week saw a new survey from doctors who are trained as oncologists, as cancer doctors, who are concerned that if they go to states with abortion bans and they have a patient who is pregnant with cancer, needs cancer treatment, abortion is no longer legal in that state, that creates a big moral problem. And these are not just moral problems for these doctors. These are legal problems. They're being told by hospital attorneys that they could be at risk for loss of license and possible jail time. And in some of these states, the bans say, well, you have an affirmative defense, doctor, that if you can prove that it was medically necessary, but then the doctor will be dragged into court and have to hire lawyers and basically have to prove their innocence, which doctors don't want to do either. So what we're seeing is doctors just not going to those states, or as we pointed out, leaving those states.
Something I'm thinking a lot about, as I'm sure you are, relates to in vitro fertilization and the Supreme Court. Listeners, in case you missed it on Monday, we're recording this on Tuesday, October 8th. On Monday, SCOTUS turned away a potential case for the new session featuring a bid by an Alabama fertility clinic to avoid a wrongful death claim in a civil lawsuit over the destruction of a couple's frozen embryo. And that claim was made possible by an Alabama law, the Wrongful Death of a Minor Act, which states, quote, that unborn children are children, end quote, even outside of the womb, ultimately creating the context for the lawsuit to take place. People have been thinking a lot about in vitro fertilization related to this discussion. I know it's more of a personhood issue, but it's been tied to this debate as we've inched closer and closer to the election. So one thing I'm wondering, What is this decision this week from SCOTUS, to decide, at least at this moment in time, to not put that case in their docket, or at least one that they're considering? What does it indicate to us about their willingness to weigh in on state-level abortion policy decisions?
Well, I don't know what it tells us, that the Supreme Court doesn't have to deal with this yet and isn't going to. That's pretty clear. They did that with another case out of Texas this week. They're not anxious to take these cases on. But the other thing it tells us, Republicans are trying to make the case that, oh, no, we believe in IVF, we believe in fertility treatment. But the ultimate goal of the anti-abortion movement is personhood, is to declare that the moment an egg and a sperm unite, that is a person with full legal rights. That is not the case legally or medically now. In fact, pregnancy does not even begin until implantation, which is somewhat later, at least medically. But if that were to be the case, all kinds of things would become illegal, all kinds of fertility treatment, many kinds of contraception. There are tax implications. There are all kinds of other implications. One of the big jokes is, well, does that mean a pregnant woman can drive in the carpool lanes? Because if she's carrying a second person with her. But it is a very serious subject, and it is something that the anti-abortion movement, much of it, does want. And it's something that Republicans, particularly former President Trump, is running away from as fast as he can because it would be so dramatic. And of course, the Republicans are claiming that the Democrats, who are claiming that personhood is the ultimate goal, are being over dramatic and trying to hype it. And the personhood sort of forces are being quiet because they would just assume that the Republicans be voted in so that they can get closer to their goal. So the Supreme Court did not help this along. They could have squashed it. They could have said, no, Alabama Supreme Court, that's not how this works. And they didn't do that. So the case will continue, and it could come back to the Supreme Court, and probably will at some point in the future.
Just to make sure I didn't miss anything, I actually haven't heard about that case out of Texas or whatever is going on there related to SCOTUS. Could you summarize that for us?
Yeah, so one of the big issues that's going on is this a state issue or is it a federal issue? There's a federal law called the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act that requires that women who present in hospital emergency rooms that participate in Medicare and Medicaid, which is basically all of them, must be given abortions if that is the indicated treatment for the emergency to prevent the imminent death or serious injury of the woman. That actually contradicts several state bans who say women can only get an abortion in that state if she's about to die, rather than if she's about to die or her health could be severely injured. We had a case out of Idaho earlier this year in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically punted, said it was too soon, sent it back. So this was a similar case out of Texas, where doctors are not permitted basically to obey the federal law because the state law says that they can't. Now, generally, federal law overrules state law, but for the moment, the Supreme Court again punted and said, we're not going to lift the stay on the federal law at this point. So that's also going to go back for more proceedings. And again, either or both of those cases are almost certain to come back to the Supreme Court at some point, so that they will have to decide, does federal law override these state bans or not?
Yeah, thanks for the quick summary there. I feel like the inside baseball of how these cases and different debates get actually in front of the Supreme Court kind of gets lost a lot of the time. There's so much to keep track of this time of year, and especially related to this issue.
I would say, and we're seeing, I think it was President Trump who said in the debate that, the Supreme Court threw out that case. They didn't really throw out that case. They sent it back. That's not the same thing.
Let's touch on his platform for a second, as well as Vice President Harris. I'm curious, not only just as it relates to IVF, but like more generally, these broader personhood/abortion related big picture policy decisions. Maybe we could go through just two quick hypotheticals, like what might a potential Trump administration look like when it comes to, tackling some of these issues? I know that's a big question mark. And then when it comes to Harris as well, what might a hypothetical Harris administration look like?
Well, I would say that a hypothetical Trump administration would have more ability to do things than a hypothetical Harris administration, because the things I think that a President Harris would want to do, she would need Congress for largely. Unless the Democrats decide to dump the filibuster in the Senate, she would need, a supermajority in the Senate, which has really never existed on this issue before and seems unlikely that it will going into next year. On the other hand, a President Trump, should he want to further restrict abortion, could do things like enforce the long on the books but never quite abandoned Comstock Act, which was an anti-vice law from the 1800s that prohibits the mailing of anything that could be used for an abortion. And people have been talking about the abortion pill in that context, but it really could be anything that's used in a surgical abortion either. You could basically stop all movement from state to state. A Donald Trump head of the Food and Drug Administration could go back and cancel the approval of the abortion pill, something the anti-abortion movement would very much like. So there are a lot of options for a anti-abortion administration. An abortion rights administration, it will be a little harder without getting Congress to act. But I know that basically the Biden administration has done about as much as an administration can do on its own. So a President Harris would simply be following in those footsteps. They've basically done all they can, and unless they could get Congress to help them, it would be hard to expand abortion rights much further. But certainly on the other side, Republicans could restrict abortion rights much more.
Julie Rovner of KFF Health News, we really appreciate your time. We're also going to link an episode of your podcast in our show notes for folks that want to check it out. It's really great for packing a lot of these very confusing health policy debates and updates. But thank you again for your time. Good luck this election season, and we hope to talk to you in the new year.
Thank you, and thanks for doing this.
Yeah, and for our listeners, you can learn more about our abortion coverage at the link in our show notes. We'll be back next week with another episode. Make sure to subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Frank Festa, and thanks for listening.